In 367 BCE, a stranger who would become the face of Greek philosophy stepped off a foreign ship into the port in Athens. This immigrant, known today as the father of logic and possibly one of the best educated people of all time, was immediately mistrusted and alienated by Athenians. During his life, he was repeatedly forced to flee the city, fearing for his own safety as different political groups gained and lost power. In spite of this, his effects on modern education are undeniable. He developed a new strategy for proving hypotheses that we now call the scientific method. He laid the groundwork for many of today's most popular subjects, like biology and astronomy. He even traveled far across the Aegean Sea to teach some of the most influential rulers of the ancient Mediterranean. Today, it is impossible to talk about ancient Greek philosophers without mentioning his name, but in his time, he was an outcast. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle's story began far away from Athens, in the northern mainland of Greece, in a city-state called Stagira. Aristotle was born around 384 BCE to a family of doctors, who may or may not have worked in the court of the Macedonian king. The Macedonian Empire had been slowly gaining power over the Mediterranean, but it didn't pose too much of a threat yet. In any event, after his father's death, Aristotle was probably sent to live with a family friend in Turkey. When Aristotle finally set sail for Athens in 367 BCE, Athens had already established itself as the center for learning in the ancient world. Aristotle would have certainly known about the famous Academy of Plato and may have even gone to Athens specifically to learn from this famous school. While in the academy, Aristotle took a special interest in a branch of subjects called the natural sciences, or subjects that have to do with the physical world, like biology, astronomy, and physics. We know that Aristotle took advantage of the Academy's resources and even witnessed a lunar eclipse. He also spent his time in the Academy collecting old phrases and slang from across the Greek-speaking world and creating a book. In all, Aristotle stayed in the Academy for nearly 20 years. Toward the end of his time in the Academy, he even began teaching classes in rhetoric, which Plato had refused to teach. Unfortunately, Athens was very xenophobic, a word which comes from the ancient Greek word xenos, or stranger. Even though Athens was the center for Greek culture, Athenian society was very harsh towards non-Athenians. While Athens was technically a democracy, the right to vote was not given to any people born outside of Athens. In addition, immigrants couldn't own property, had to pay a specific tax to the city, and even had to have a designated Athenian sponsor. Tragedy struck in 347 BCE when the king of Macedonia, Philip, conquered the nearby town of Olynthus, allowing Athenian leader Demosthenes to rise to power. Now, Demosthenes was very anti-Macedonian, while Aristotle was considered to be sympathetic to the kingdom. Plus, Plato died that same year, and selected his nephew, Speusippus, to succeed him as head of the academy. So, in 347, Aristotle decided to leave Athens, beginning a journey across the Mediterranean that would last 12 years. It's hard to know exactly what Aristotle did in the years between 347 and 335 BCE. We know that from around 343 to 340, he tutored the Macedonian prince Alexander the Great, who was only 13 at the time. This period certainly strengthened Aristotle's ties to the kingdom of Macedon, and Alexander would continue to be a supporter of Aristotle for the rest of his life. In addition to this, Aristotle likely traveled a lot, studying the biology of native plants and animals and islands across the Mediterranean. When Aristotle finally returned to Athens in 335 BCE, he decided to open his own school. This school was notably separate from Plato's academy. Not only was it located far from the academy neighborhood where Plato had lived, but Aristotle's approach to education was also very different. Sure, many of Aristotle's main ideas can be traced back to Plato's philosophy, but while Plato believed that the pursuit of truth was a spiritual experience, Aristotle saw education as a pathway for improving one's life. Aristotle believed that you could only be truly happy if you followed all of the rules of the universe, and the only way to know what these rules were was by learning everything you could about the world around you. Okay, for example, a doctor can only cure someone if they know what is good for the body versus what is bad. So Aristotle reasoned that in learning how to be a doctor, a person must learn how to distinguish good things from bad things. If you can learn how to be a doctor, then you can learn how to be a good person, and therefore how to live your life according to the rules of the universe. All that to say, Aristotle's school was entirely his own. But Athenian law stated that no immigrants could own land, so Aristotle couldn't just buy a building for his school like Plato had. Instead, Aristotle had to set up his school in a public place, somewhere he could visit whenever he wanted, spend hours of his day, and where his students wouldn't be distracted by the bustling crowds of Athens. Luckily, he found just the place. Aristotle taught in the Temple of Apollo Lycaon, also known as the Lyceum. The Lyceum had been used as a meeting spot for philosophers for decades and had even hosted Isocrates' school for rhetoric. Aristotle and his students would take their classes while strolling through the shaded halls of the Lyceum's peripatos, which means walkway, giving Aristotle's school the name peripatetic. Morning strolls were reserved for the most advanced students, while evening classes were open to the public. It's hard to know exactly what Aristotle taught in his school. Since Aristotle did not technically own the Lyceum, his lessons were not as distinct as Plato's were within the academy. Still, we can see glimpses of Aristotle's lesson plans in ancient texts. You see, Aristotle wrote well over 100 works during his lifetime, ranging from research papers to social and political critiques. Today, we split Aristotle's works into two main groups: exoteric writing, or big and glossy books meant to be shared throughout the Greek-speaking world, and esoteric works. It is believed that Aristotle's esoteric works were only meant for students of his peripatetic school. We can think of these esoteric works almost like lecture notes for his classes, just brief bullet points and unfinished ideas. So what did Aristotle lecture on? Unsurprisingly, Aristotle's esoteric lesson plans matched his scientific interests. For example, his research on animals references studies he probably did while visiting Lesbos before he returned to Athens, while On the Heavens contains anecdotes from his time in Plato's academy. So, based on his known works, we assume that Aristotle taught a wide range of subjects at his school, such as physics and biology, meteorology and astronomy, and ethics and politics. Since Aristotle had formerly taught in Plato's academy, it is not surprising that some of his lesson plans are dialectic or conversational, a style popularized by Plato. At the same time, Aristotle knew that facts could only be verified through scientific experiments. He believed that finding the truth should involve both probabilities, which could be reasoned out through conversation, and tested certainties. This step-by-step guide to testing hypotheses is now known as the scientific method. We can think of Aristotle's lessons like walking discussions, where students were encouraged to ask questions about the material, while Aristotle did his best to find answers and guide his students closer to the truth. He believed that it was important for students and teachers to hold themselves as equals. He knew his students were just as capable of conducting experiments and reaching their own conclusions as he was. He saw himself as nothing more than a mentor. One of the things that stood out about Aristotle's school was his impressive collection of books. We know that Aristotle loved to read and even pioneered the science of literary criticism, that is, reading plays and books and trying to understand their deeper meanings. Still, since Aristotle did not own the Lyceum, he likely had to keep his collection of books at home. After he died, many of Aristotle's books ended up in the Library of Alexandria, where they were carefully studied, cataloged, and eventually burned with the rest of the library. Still, Aristotle was not particularly famous while he was alive. It is thanks in large part to the Library of Alexandria that more and more people became aware of Aristotle's brilliant writing, producing the very copies that have allowed his works to survive to this day. Like many things in Aristotle's life, his time teaching in Athens was unfortunately interrupted. In 323 BCE, the new king of Macedon and Aristotle's former student Alexander the Great died. Although Athens had generally resented Macedon for years, it wasn't until Alexander's death, leaving the Macedonian Empire without a ruler, that they felt they could do anything about it. Once Alexander died, the anti-Macedonian party that had driven Aristotle away from Athens all those years ago came back into power. Once again, Aristotle was driven away from his home and school in Athens. He found refuge in the nearby island of Chalcis, where he would die from a disease just a year later. Aristotle's presence and school in Athens were constantly defined by his political status as an immigrant. And yet, for all of the trouble that Athens' laws caused, Aristotle never lost faith in education. He never stopped believing that his situation could be made better by learning more about the world. In teaching philosophy, Aristotle hoped to help the people around him learn more about the world they lived in, and in doing so, learn more about themselves.